Welcome everybody to the June edition of Cloud Office Hours for our You Already Own It customers. This month's session is about protecting your Azure environment from threats. I'm very excited. We have a guest speaker this month, Dennis Guzy from Microsoft. I'll get into further intro of Dennis in just a second. So we're going to start off with our Azure Security Center overview and then any open mic questions you may have following. So your You Already Own It team is myself, Bob Ballard, Jerry Martin, Aaron Ward, George Scott, and Scott Dowling. That makes up the cloud strategist team here at Planet. We're kept in running lockstep by Mary Tucker, and of course the guidance of our VP who sponsors the program, Steve Winter. Don't forget, as a You Already Own It customer, you have access to the You Already Own It at go-planet.com alias, where you can reach out to the team at any time and get answers to burning questions around strategy and adoption and which product to use for what thing. Make sure you leverage that benefit. We're happy to help you. We try to turn around in less than a 24-hour SLA, so make sure to take advantage of the opportunity there. So to kick off the session, I'm just going to start by saying we have Dennis Guzy, who's the Director of Emerging Markets for the Azure Group. We're for state and local government at Microsoft. I am proud and to have had Dennis as a colleague for a number of years, as well as I like to call him a friend. So when we don't have guest speakers for this session. However, as we were putting together the session, I was looking for some topics, and I sort of pinged Dennis. And while this session is definitely something that I'm very passionate about, and I think our customers should be as well, this is really a passion project for Dennis. So I thought, who better than to bring the man, the myth, and the legend on himself to talk about it. So let's hear it for Dennis Guzy.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for the time to talk to everyone today. As Bob mentioned, my name is Dennis Guzy. I'm the Director of Emerging Markets for our state and local government practice at Microsoft. And what I'm going to do is take you through a series of slides and some bits of information here to get things moving. And really what I want to do is talk to you about how Azure Security Center protects cloud workloads against cyber threats. In other sessions and in other conversations, you probably have had conversations and heard about Microsoft security posture as it relates to other modern workplace services like Office 365. Today I'm going to focus specifically on what Security Center brings to the table to enhance some of those concepts and really build on what capabilities exist inside of our technology. So cloud security, first and foremost, to set some clarity here, really is a shared responsibility, and it's something you've probably heard before and will continue to have that reinforcement. But one of the things that I wanted to start off with is really trying to define some of the components where Microsoft provides some built-in controls, and that's really what we're going to talk about today in some parts of these conversations. So when we talk about the joint responsibility between Microsoft and our customers, the focus is on securing and managing resources that are inside of Azure, and that joint responsibility is something that Microsoft takes seriously and obviously wants to work with our customers to make sure they're able to help meet those requirements. So on the Microsoft side, we're focused on the security and management of the physical assets. So there's all the different layers of security and protection that are in place, just like you've probably heard before for things like Office 365, when it comes to the perimeter of the buildings right into the computer and server rooms, and things like our state-of-the-art security controls and video, et cetera. Everybody's verified. There's a number of processes in place. When we get into that joint responsibility, and those are the things where we enable you as a customer to be able to have tools and processes in place to be able to really focus on managing and securing those workloads. So when we talk about security inside of Azure, we've got these different layers that we focus on, and we really try to drive each of our customers to think about. there's identity and access management, which I'm sure you've heard about, talked about before, and will continue to hear and talk about. Network, is obviously paramount to, controlling your network and managing your network in terms of being able to connect to the cloud. And then getting into the more specific areas where we dive into things like data security, threat protection, and the overall security management process. When we think about security and having this conversation, and when we're talking about how people are attacking the cloud infrastructure, adversaries are often attacking multiple resources to try to obtain the data or the secrets or the information that they're really looking for. So that cloud kill chain model that I have up here really, kind of goes over how the attackers are trying to gain access to the different resources that you have. And when you think of any resources connected to a public cloud, there's really a 4-step process as it relates to their efforts. There's the exposure, access, lateral movement, and their actions. And exposure is where attackers are looking for opportunities to gain access to your infrastructure. So, for example, attackers know there's a customer citizen-facing application has to be open, for legitimate users to access them. So those applications are exposed to the internet, therefore they're susceptible to attacks. So attackers will try to attack any vulnerabilities or look for exploits like weak credentials in those applications, and that exposure can be found in vulnerabilities or malware-based attacks where those credentials can become compromised. Attackers will try to exploit things like exposure to gain access to your public cloud infrastructure, and that's when we move into that access window. And this can be done once they've compromised those user credentials, compromised instances, compromised misconfigured resources. When they've compromised those resources, attackers can gain access to those instances by exploiting a vulnerability, again, like a public-facing web application, or exploiting those, credentials using something like brute force and a public-facing, SSH server. So without the right security controls in place, approximately 68% of all breaches take months or longer to discover without those controls. During the lateral movement stage, attackers discover what other resources they have access to and what the scope of that access is. So successful attacks on instances give attackers access to things like databases and other sensitive information. And the attacker then searches for more credentials and a greater level of visibility into your environment. Without tools in place to notify you when an attack is taking place, it takes on the average 101 days to discover a breach. Meanwhile, in just 24 to 48 hours after the breach, the attacker usually will have complete control of the network. And the last is the actions. And this is where the actions an attacker takes after that lateral movement really depend on the resources they were able to gain access to during that lateral movement phase. So attackers are taking actions like, that can cause data exfiltration, data loss, or launch other types of attacks. So for different organizations, there can be significant, massive financial impact, and in state and local government specifically, there are typically rules or laws that govern things that are related to what happens post a breach and what, if any, fiscal responsibility exists as it relates to that. So what Azure Security Center does is it's a unified infrastructure security management system that really strengthens the security posture of your data centers and, just as importantly, provides advanced threat protection across your hybrid workloads that you're running in the cloud. And I want to be very specific. I'm talking about whether they're running in Azure or not. So that means those on-premise applications and processes that you're running can also be protected by the Security Center tool. So keeping your resources safe is a joint effort between you and any cloud provider you choose, such as Microsoft with their Azure cloud environment. You have to make sure that those workloads are as secure as you're moving to the cloud. And at the same time, when you're running that hybrid infrastructure, you want to make sure that you're not abdicating that responsibility that you have. And there are different areas and ways that Microsoft helps take on that burden with some of our platform as a service offerings, for example, or our software as a service offerings for those customers that are Office 365, customers, for example, the level of security controls and implementation effort, varies based on the different type of service that you're using. But either way, the Azure Security Center service provides tools that will harden the network, secure those services, and more importantly, make sure that you've increased and created a positive security posture. One thing that I did want to mention is Security Center is natively part of Azure. Platform as a service services that are running in Azure, like Service Fabric or SQL databases, storage accounts, etc., are all monitored and protected by Security Center without needing any type of deployment. So there's no, endpoints or anything like that has to get installed to protect those types of instances. As I mentioned, Security Center does also protect those non-Azure servers and virtual machines in the cloud or on premises. And again, you'll see that we're talking traversing clouds here. So, if you are using other cloud service providers like the Amazons, for example, of the world, Security Center has the ability to protect those workloads as well. And it's not just Windows workloads. It's Windows and Linux server by having a monitoring agent that it would run on those different virtual machines. So let's get into, a couple specifics. From an architecture perspective, really what we have is we have all the different types of services that you might be running, whether it's on-prem, multi-cloud, hybrid with your own data center. And we're talking about those infrastructure as a service offerings, so VMs that are running, your network data, your virtual machines that might be running on VMware or Hyper-V, or AWS, et cetera. And that's where we're getting into how Security Center will take all that data, leverage things like machine learning, et cetera, and the workspace management, and deliver all that into a single overview dashboard, which, for most folks is really what they're looking for, is that single pane of glass to really understand, what's going on in their environment. So let's start off with talking about that, strengthening that overall security posture. And the way that we start that is, and for those that, if you're running Office 365, this is something that should be, at least if you're caring about security, should be familiar with you, is something called Secure Score. And Secure Score is something that, again, in Office 365, you have some of that visibility, into your Secure Score for those services. Well, we have the same thing inside of Azure. And what we're able to do is give you that instant insight into really the overall security state of everything that's running inside of your Azure and also your hybrid environments. It also gives you, the Secure Score gives you the ability to focus on and address vulnerabilities, and it also prioritizes the recommendations. And of course, if you're, someone like me who doesn't like to see a low score, you have the steps are there to actually, tell you what methods and items you need to do to increase your overall secure score. One of the other key components of what exists inside of Security Center is creating organizational-wide security policies and really focusing on assessing compliance inside your organization. And one of the really brilliant things about the way that Security Center operates is you have the ability to create silos where necessary and organizational-wide policies where applicable. So you can create unique policies for unique applications, organizations, sections, divisions, et cetera, that might exist inside the environment, to make sure that you're creating a security policy that works for you, not a security policy that has to be adopted by all, which is, to me, is super critical. And having spent almost 10 years in government before coming to Microsoft, I recognize that not every department or agency either operates or wants to operate at the same level of some of their sibling agencies or divisions or sections, et cetera. One of the other things that you're able to do is also focus on the overall compliance of your organization, from a dashboard perspective. And we're going to get in and actually show some of those things in just a minute. So I wanted to start off with talking about that Security Center dashboard. This is that single pane of glass that really tells you what's going on inside of your organization when you're running Security Center. And the Secure Score, if you're not familiar with it, it's an analytics tool that gives you that visibility into the overall security posture And at the end of the day, the goal of what we're showing here is to be able to answer the question, how secure are the workloads that I'm running in the cloud? So what you see on this screenshot, and if time permits, we'll actually, hopefully be able to show you some of this. And by the way, as a follow-up, of course, the resources at Planet are by far one of the best partners that Microsoft has for our customers in being able to implement this solution. So I know that if there's follow-up, they're definitely going to be jumping in and engaging with you on that. But what we're trying to do here is give you not only the ability to visualize, really where you're at, but also the processes and steps to be able to remediate any issues that are coming up. The goal is fast triage. The goal is meaningful suggestions that are actually valuable. And anybody who does any work in security knows that there's that information overload that happens. And if you've ever, are bored and you really want to see how many types of alerts that can happen on your Windows, preferably Windows 10 running the latest update, open up the logs and just look at the application or Windows logs, and you'll see, thousands, tens of thousands of alerts in there. Most of them are innocuous, and they really don't mean much in terms of, your machine's operation. Oftentimes it's connecting to the network, it's doing this, it's validating some, application's permissions to be able to do something. But it's getting through and being able to whittle out what should I actually care about, what's important, and what matters. So when we dive into and choose a specific workload, for example, that we're going to look at, is where we get into things like the actual recommendations that come up. And I apologize, I know sometimes when you see screenshots with things blacked out, it might lead you to believe that there's something confusing there. I, for purposes of privacy, because I actually take screenshots of my own demo environments, I have different subscriptions. And by the way, subscriptions are, if you're not familiar with it, are ways that you can break out your overall usage inside of Azure. Some organizations, for example, might break out a subscription based on the different departments. It could be different projects, etc. But for privacy purposes, I always make sure I black those things out. So you'll see that in a couple of the slides, and I should apologize if that confuses you in any way. It's just me covering up subscription names so that we don't give away any of my server secrets, which would lead you to try to hack in. But of course, I have Security Center, which would protect me against you. But that being said, when we get into the subscriptions review, for example, when we get into some of those recommendations, that's the heart of Security Center's value lies in its ability to give you recommendations. And those recommendations are tailored to specific security concerns that are found on your workload specifically. So Security Center does the security admin work for you by finding any vulnerabilities that might exist, but then providing you the specific instructions on how to get rid of them, up to and including the ability to create automated remediation processes. So when we look at the specific, details, when we look into something specifically, you'll see in the screenshot here, things like enable MFA, for example, because of the type of workload that you're running. So Security Center enables you not just to set the policies, but really to be able to go and apply specific configuration standards across all of your resources that you're running. And again, the focus on these recommendations is to help you reduce that surface attack, the attack surface across each of those resources. Again, you'll see recommendations in here that exist for things like SQL, things like PAS. So when Security Center's looking at a subscription, for example, that might be for a division, a department, or maybe your entire org, because it's evaluating all those different resources, it's going to tell you, hey, you're running a SQL database that potentially doesn't have as much security on it as it should have, or you might have security gaps in your environment. And the great thing is many of the remediation steps are able to be resolved with things like a single click. And when we get into the nuanced details of the specific recommendation, and again, this is just me showing you screenshots of having clicked on something specifically. When you get into the individual items, each individual item that comes up is an actual recommendation. It has a score. And again, the score is mostly to give you an idea and give you a numeric representation of how secure or potentially insecure you are based on the overall evaluation. So when you see here something like your remediation score, right now you're at 0 of 50 in this screenshot. And, for example, it's saying you need to have multi-factor authentication enabled for all your subscriptions because of the potential breach opportunities. And that's one of those things you'll see over and over and over as an example. But it then has the remediation steps. So when you click that link to enable MFA for accounts, you have that ability to create an automated result where it automatically turns that on. And once you apply those remediation steps, of course, it's actually going to give you a numeric value that, represents how complete you are against that. So in this case, if I have 2 subscriptions that are unhealthy and I enabled MFA on one, you could imagine I'm going to get a 25 out of 50 score, for example. That's how that process works. That's really what that numeric representation is for you. The second piece to this overall dashboards concept, and again, having come from government and working with customers that have a number of unique and specific regulatory compliance requirements, the other type of dashboard that sits inside of Security Center is the regulatory compliance dashboard. And what Security Center does is it helps streamline that process for meeting those regulatory compliance requirements using this regulatory compliance dashboard. So in the dashboard, Security Center provides insights into your compliance posture, just like it did on the security posture, based on the continuous assessments that are happening inside of your Azure environment. And these are not, things that are done once a week or once a month. These are happening ongoing Azure enabling and managing services. The assessments are performed by Security Center. By analyzing different risk factors that that exist inside of your environment in according with whatever the security best practice is. So in the screenshot, for example, you'll see standards like CIS, PCI DSS, ISO 27001, SOC TSP, etc. There are additional regulatory compliance dashboards or views are coming, things like HIPAA. Are coming, and some things like CIS are very common standards. So the standards that are out there that allow you to map to those different types of components. So when we look at those itemized recommendations, you might see some commonality there. You'll see things like, hey, enable, ensure that multi-factor authentication is enabled. Well, this is a CIS recommended policy. So because that continuous assessment is happening, it's going to look at those issues and potential vulnerabilities, and then those recommendations are going to be, brought to the forefront, which are going to focus on different ways you can improve your overall security hygiene as it relates to compliance. So those compliance standards are just that. They are standards. They are not Microsoft's interpretation of best practices. They are predefined by a regulatory body or regulatory, industry control, as the overall best practices. So I just want to be clear, when we get into the regulatory and compliance section, that isn't Microsoft's interpretation. That is the interpretation. That is the CIS benchmark or, the PCI DSS benchmarks that are being set, for these items. And when you implement those controls and you go through the process to implement those different capabilities, you'll see some different things visually. You see the red, the green in terms of, where you're getting that visual cue as to the more red, obviously, the more at risk you are, based on the overall number of resources that you have. And you'll see those numbers that are bolded, for example, that says 32 of my 113 machines, for example, and of my virtual machines don't have an endpoint protection solution running on there. Things like that to be able to go through and resolve. And again, just like the process might dictate, if you want to see an overall view of how you align up to each of these different, and again, for the customers that I deal with in state and local government, but really across Microsoft's regulated industries, as we introduce more of these regulatory compliance controls, you can see, and you've got that visual cue here, really all that red is not necessarily a good thing, but it's, for demo purposes, it's really helpful. But that visual cue tells you really how much do you align, to each of those different regulatory compliance controls. And I did want to point out, and again, if time permits, we might have time to show it, you do have the ability to actually, just as you did with the Secure Score and the dashboards through the Security Center, you have the ability to go through and remediate that, as well as create policies that automatically apply things like the CIS controls. And in a conversation like this, I want to make sure I'm super clear. This is an initial, type of overview of some at a very high level of some of these features. There's a lot of depth that exists inside of Security Center. When we get into talking about things like how specifically we focus on protecting those threats, these are a lot of those controls and those components that you'll be able to implement to be able to create those protection sources for you. So Security Center's threat protection enables you to detect and prevent threats at the infrastructure as a service layer. As I mentioned, non-Azure servers are included in this, as well as things like platform as a service components inside of Azure. So Security Center's threat protection includes a fusion kill chain analysis that's taking place on any of those services that's running. And what it does is it automatically correlates any alerts that are happening inside of your environment based on a cyber kill chain analysis. And this is where that machine learning, where you've probably, again, heard in prior conversations with Bob and the other resources at Planet about all the different signals that come into Microsoft from all of our customers worldwide that are, acknowledged, absorbed, and then, turned into via machine learning the data that kill chain analysis is done against. And it's done to help give you a better way to understand the full story of how people are attacking environments, not just your environment specifically, but attacks in general, where it started, what impact did it have on your resources, if any. With Security Center, you also get native integration with the Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection client out of the box. So this means that without any specific additional configuration, your Windows virtual machines and servers are completely integrated with Security Center's recommendations and assessments. Advanced threat detection is also offered out of the box for Linux virtual machines and servers that you're running as well. So Security Center also lets you automate application control policies that are running on these servers as well. So the adaptive application controls in Security Center enable you the ability to have end-to-end app whitelisting across your Windows servers. You don't need to create roles and check violations. It's all done automatically for you. And again, the goal is to try to reduce the number of cycles that your admins are forced or focused on that take them away for other important work that they've got. So when we talk about another methodology in terms of protection, we're talking about those cloud, protecting all those cloud native services from threats as well. So Security Center lets you detect, threats across any type of, Azure platform as a service, as well as things like the app service, SQL, storage accounts, other data services, as well. And what we're looking at, when we get into this is we start looking at things like the container detection, and we're looking at privileged containers. So you're getting alerts when a container is created on a host. Privileged commands. So if privileged commands are being run on different types of containers and Docker, et cetera, you can get alerts when SSH servers are being run inside of containers, as an example. So these are all things where when you start thinking about the abnormal type of behavior, the attacker who may have gained access via compromised credentials running an SSH server, creating exposure on different ports, et cetera, having those alerts and a process in place that creates some automated results to protect and block those different types of attacks. One of the things that I did want to talk about as well is how Security Center includes capabilities that help you perform automatic classification of your data inside of SQL. In this way, by doing that, you've got the ability to know the level of protection you then have to apply to that data that may be unique to that data, specifically that database and the data that's being stored in that database. You're also going to get assessments for vulnerabilities across Azure SQL and the other storage services and the recommendations on how to mitigate those. So one of the most important things you can take away from this slide specifically is that third bullet point, being able to discover, classify, label, and protect sensitive data inside of your databases. This means you being able to, from a, government organization, from a regulated industry perspective, say, I need to know if there's personally identifiable information. I need to know if there's personal health information. I need to know if there's FTI data, inside of these databases. And if they are, they need to be protected at a certain layer, at a certain level of protection that might be different than maybe just, names and phone numbers. And don't get me wrong, I recognize that a name and a phone number may actually be PII, but you may have different grading views as to what constitutes what type of data and what type of protection might exist. And for example, the state that I'm in right now, the state that I'm from, Pennsylvania, has very specific laws around the way data has to be stored, retained, and protected that might be different from the Commonwealth of Virginia to the state of Michigan to the state of California, for example. So the ability to be able to create some customized policies and know that based on the way something is classified and labeled, and having the ability to create customized protection becomes critical. And things like your data sources, especially SQL databases, often or most often, or even your Azure storage, things like on your file servers, are the places where your users, and please don't take this as an attack on your users most often are one of your biggest threats because they will inadvertently or unintentionally store something in a way that they shouldn't. So this helps you protect against that. One of the other really, actually one of my favorite features that exists inside of Security Center, and I'm super passionate about security, and I'm a nerd of epic proportions, so that might be bleeding through as I'm talking here. But one of my favorite aspects of Security Center is being able to focus on preventing and limiting exposure to things like brute force attacks. So we're able to do that in Security Center because we can reduce access to virtual machine ports using something called just-in-time VM access. And what that allows you to do is create specific rules and specific limits in place for how users, admins, etc., can access a virtual machine that's running on your environment. Because, again, if you focus on security, all VMs that you put inside of Azure or inside of any environment, your data center, any other public cloud service, Microsoft, etc., are one of the areas that those attackers will focus on, as a primary potential source, for infiltration. So we're able to limit exposure to those attacks by using access and application controls to block that malicious activity. What just-in-time or JIT does is it applies a layer to the virtual machine that allows you to provide controlled and audited access to VMs only when needed. So that adaptive application control allows you to harden VMs by controlling which applications can run on your VMs. When we're talking about using Security Center, we're talking about being able to do things with machine learning, for example, that analyzes the processes running in a VM and helps you create whitelisting rules to say, this is normal. This is a normal process. These types of processes are typically normal. We typically see them running on servers, etc. And you can create, secure access policies for very specific ports, for specific users, only from certain IP addresses or certain IP address ranges, and more importantly, for a limited amount of time. So I have the ability to say, Bob, who, as Bob mentioned, Bob's one of the most brilliant minds in cloud that I've gotten a chance to work with. I love Bob, but I don't trust Bob. And in my environment, when Bob has access, he has to use just in time, and I limit his time because even though I know Bob is brilliant, I don't necessarily trust the device that Bob is using, that it itself hasn't been compromised. So it's all part of that mentality in the world of security around limiting trust, and it's always that trust but verify process. So one last thing that I wanted to show when talking about the machine learning process and what we're talking about there when we're doing that analysis is where we get into how we're able to correlate an attacker gaining access to something like a virtual machine and sending emails and what happens and what that looks like. And what it is, and this is an example of an alert process that would exist inside of our Azure Security Center, where a user somehow gains access to and compromises a VM and starts sending out spam messages, which is one of the most common and I'll say innocuous ways that an attacker compromises your environment but doesn't really do a lot to to attack any specific data or anything like that yet. And because of the native integration that exists and the seamless integration that we have with the other Microsoft products like Cloud App Security or Defender Advanced Threat Protection that runs on the desktops, we have the ability to be able to create a process that tracks everything back and gives you a full ability from an investigative analysis perspective. So we've got a lot of capabilities that exist there, and when you get into the alerts, we don't, it's not just, hey, this bad thing, has happened or this bad thing is happening. It's exactly what it happened to, where did it happen, what methodology was used, and what ways to protect and remediate against, that issue that has taken place. So to kind of recap all the things that, that you saw, Azure Security Center's job is to really, focus on getting you secure faster. Our job in providing this service is to, again, not tell you what cloud to use or that you have to use just one cloud. Of course, I'd love it if you were only using Microsoft technologies, but I recognize that that's not going to be the case for every customer. It's really about also helping you discover and onboard additional resources, making any resources that get created, whether it's data, databases, storage, servers, etc., compliant via policies. It's to give you a unified view of security across all those workloads. But just as important, it's designed to integrate with things like SIEMs or Azure Sentinel, which I believe is one of the future topics that is going to be coming up here that Bob mentioned to me that is going to be talked about. And at the end of the day, it's this concept of compliance in a click. And it's making sure that you have the ability to create a compliance model that really works for you. So look, there's a lot of information that I put out there, and I gave you a very, very high level for much of that information. There are some things you can absolutely do today if you're running Azure in your environment. First and foremost, the folks at Planet, as I mentioned, are absolutely one of the top partners to work with, to give you guidance and to work with you on what to do next. If you haven't already, you do have the ability to be able to enable Security Center at a no-cost option where you're able to go through, and see different components where there's not a cost that gets turned on to be able to activate that. There are some different layers that once you want to enable some of the automation and some of the additional controls, where it does add some costs, I definitely want you to work with Planet or your Microsoft resource to learn more information about that. I put, and I'm sure Bob shares this information, I did want to make sure for anybody who does like to get a little bit more into the technical weeds and kind of like, how do I get started? If I wanted to, to do this, and I know I'm going to contact Planet at some point to kind of get me started, but I really just want to, have an idea of what I'm looking at here, what I'm working with. I put some links together that basically are, best practices that relates to security inside of Azure. How do you get started with Azure Security Center for those of us nerds who love things like PowerShell, all the PowerShell and some great examples, as well as if you haven't worked with it yet, the CIS security benchmark and framework for compliance is also something I think is really important for anybody in a regulated industry and a government customer to be able to take a look at. And with that, I'll pause. I've been talking quite a bit, so there might be questions or comments from Bob or any of the folks that are on.
I will. This is Bob. I will chime in real quick to say we absolutely are covering Azure Sentinel. That will be next month's topic. So Scott Dowling and myself will be covering that topic next month. So if there's interest there, stay tuned. Hop on next month's call.
Awesome. And I believe we do have a little bit of time, right, Bob? I can
Yep, you can absolutely try your demo there, big guy.
All right, so let's see. I'm going to share out my desktop. Hopefully this works. And Bob, when it shares, can you just let me know? It's thinking right now about sharing, so.
I will. It looks like it's loading.
Okay. You just let me know when you should see Azure Security Center.
I got it right now. You're good.
Now, I'm one of those folks, just for anybody on, I like the dark mode for my browser for all my components, so this might look a little different than your Azure environment. It's just I like to flip that mode on. It's easier for me to see. So what I have here is an actual real live environment. Let me just drop that down a little bit. And these are actual recommendations against actual subscriptions that are live. This is, when I say this is a demo environment, I have real servers running. These are real scores. When we talk about the policy and compliance and we get into things like threat protection, as I take a look at these different pieces. What I have here is the ability, when we get into something, and you saw this in some of the screenshots, when I look at the overall score, and you are going to see, and for this environment, it's okay. There's nothing secret that I have here. I have multiple environments. This is one that I don't mind when the subscription information is exposed. You can see that I have a bunch of different Azure subscriptions that are listed. And I know there was a question, I think, put in the IM window, but I can't see it since I'm sharing. So if it's something we need to reference, Bob, just let me know. You see that I have different scores for the different subscriptions. So for this Contoso IT, I've got 135 out of 205. That's not too bad. On this demo environment, I've got 545 out of 1030. And those different numbers are representative of the different types of workloads that are associated with those subscriptions. So if I bring up this Contoso infrastructure, there's very little running there. So there's very little in terms of recommendations that exists. But you can see, for example, one of the suggestions is, to restrict access to certain applications, some app services that are running, and it's giving me information related to that process, and it's telling me why. What are the threats that I need to be worried about? What are the concerns that I have? What are the instructions if there's not an automated remediation? And because this is an app service, there's not always going to be automated remediation for some of these recommendations, because it might require you to interact or focus on an application that might have some specific type of of coding or things that are related to it or behind it. So, it's not something where every solution is always going to be automated, but we've got instructions on what to do. We've got the resources that are considered unhealthy that are running those types of, of applications and processes that are part of that subscription. So these are the different, areas when we talk about being able to go through and look at things like the different remediation. The same thing when we get into, as I mentioned, that regulatory compliance control. And when we get into what that looks like for the different benchmarks that exist, and you can see I don't have a lot of controls that are passing based on these benchmarks. Now, again, to be candid, obviously I have these things set up so that it makes it very friendly and easy for me to be able to demo. But what it's looking at is the different and most significant concerns, and it's prioritizing those for me as well, and telling me what are the things that I should be most concerned about. What are the resources and subscriptions that I'm actually applying this benchmark to? Because that's the other thing that I probably wasn't as clear as I should have been when showing the slides, is that I can have it where, maybe I only have a certain segment of my organization that has PCI requirements. I can have it where their workloads, their subscriptions, their components that are being run in this hybrid environment are the ones that are most that are being evaluated against that specific benchmark, or that I care to evaluate against that specific benchmark. One of the other things that I did want to
and real
also
quick, before you move on, Dennis,
yeah.
The question was, if you're using third-party MFA in your solution, is SecureScore able to account for that?
So it can, but what I will say is the limitation of the third-party MFA is there are some third-party MFA providers that are more friendly than others. So the ability to recognize that solution is running is actually dictated by that solution. So some of those solution providers radically restrict the ability to interact with that information and interact with those services. So It's not a one-size-fits-all answer. It's not a blanket yes, but many of the common or popular MFA services do allow integration into the service. It's just not all of them. And again, as you can imagine, it's going to be one of those things where you'll want to make sure you work with Planet, Microsoft, and that security provider to make sure that your integration is as deep as possible. So one of the other things, if that addressed that question, Bob, if one of the other things I want to talk about that wasn't in the screenshots, but is one of those things that I did want to make sure I included in the demo discussion is, what happens when I get an alert? You heard me talk about it. You heard me talk about, well, there's an alert. There's a security incident happening. There's something going on. How do I remediate that? What does that look like? And what I have here, and again, just to be clear, I have a bunch of services that I run. I was joking, telling Bob when we were talking about doing the session that I have a bunch of servers that, the service just absolutely screams at me for, saying, why are you leaving all these things open? And I'm doing it so that I'm able to do things like this with this demo and show an alert. And we see that there's, in this case, a suspicious double execution of a file has occurred, and there's the details. When did it start? What resource did it start with? What do they consider the alert? You saw it was prioritized, the number one alert that came up. There's, escalate the alert to security team. It's giving me my remediation steps. Focus on the remediation. It's giving me the details about this. But one of the things I'm able to do is actually go in and investigate what actually happened with that alert. And what I get, and it'll take a second to load up, is this entire investigation path of what happened, what services, how to prioritize the different components. And you see that the screen, changed. There's this little, visual that's showing, the process was executed, against the different services, et cetera. And on the right-hand side, we're able to see the different things like, what was the general information. We're able to get into the entities that were involved, and I'm just highlighting some of those to show you, as it goes through. And as I'm basically, connecting and going through what were the different components that were connected, you start to see, and this is happening real time. Like it wasn't because I was just clicking on things. It's building out this map to tell me what intersected with what. So when you start to think about, well, using that example earlier that I had where, Bob was connecting to the service and what happened if his machine was compromised when he connected in, this allows me to basically zoom in and zoom out of, what is going on from, an activity, and what did that activity trigger in terms of connecting to another process. So we see there was an anti-malware action taken, which means that, again, if we start to dig into this, where I have the ability to look and see the specific information about that actual event, but we're able to see, and as you can imagine, attackers don't attack, and when they're successful, it's sort of like a ping pong ball or a pinball that's bouncing around a machine. It's not just, oh, let's have this nice tree, like of a yes, no, can I get into this? Yes, then no. Typically, once they've compromised an environment, they're running 4, 5, 50 actions in parallel, which will start creating these different zigzags that you're seeing here in terms of interaction. So they might be running 1, 2, 10 processes that are all interacting with each other, which are trying to then look for other, other compromised capabilities inside the environment. So as I click through, I'm able to drill further and further in. And again, I know it might be difficult. This is one of those things where you definitely want to work with Planet and Microsoft if you want to see deeper, where when I clicked on that suspicious shadow copying, I actually saw the devices popped up, this work group, who was involved in it, who they specifically attacked. And again, as I dig into it more, I'm able to see, the information, how many alerts did that generate from that specific work group that this, event took place and this, the event triggered and what's going on there. So when we think of that kill chain that I talked about very early in the conversation, you actually are able to start to visualize these different things. And I can see that, what alert took place on what action. And if I want to dig into each of the alerts that took place on that specific server or device, I'm able to see when was that alert created. And this is that machine learning that I was talking about. This is I'm consuming all of those alerts that are coming out of a device, that are coming out of processes that are running on your virtual machines, whether they're Windows or Linux, whether they're in our cloud or in your data center or in another cloud provider. And I'm consuming all those and saying, wait a second, this is a suspicious process that I'm seeing running. I need to alert, and a certain number of alerts is going to cause me to trigger something. Now, in these scenarios, in the things that I'm scrolling through, I specifically did not create any automated remediation. I want to be super clear. I'm allowing some of these things to happen. I can using Security Center, and that's where when we have more time and you have the ability to work with the resources at Microsoft and Planet, we can get into saying, okay, let's look at this scenario. How would we remediate it to resolve, and how do we remediate it moving forward, and create some automated remediation steps? How do I isolate this device so that it couldn't have attempted to infect these other servers and these other users? And that's the power of what we get in Security Center. And I know this is one of those things. It's not easy to just show screenshots of being able to work through an investigation, but these are typically things that you're trying to connect from 1, 2, 10 different services from your SIEM, from all these other sources, and then saying, well, now how do I put it all together and figure out what happened? Easy. I look at the screen and I start clicking to be able to interact with them now. And for anybody who's in the world of security and who spends a lot of time trying to figure out what happened where, this is a game changer. The ability to see this investigative dashboard and be able to see all the events, all the actions, all the alerts, all the logs, everything in single clicks without having to go into different systems is a game changer. So I think we're at time, and I don't want to go over. I want to be super mindful of everybody's time. Pause if there's any questions or things that you thought you might hear about or want to talk about, or if you've got any questions specifically for me, I'm happy to answer them.
I am taking over, Dennis.
Awesome. Okay.
All right. We're just going to wrap up real quick. First of all, thanks very much, Dennis, for joining us. That was extremely informative, and I'm glad you were able to come on and share the information with our valued customers today. Just to sort of wrap up, just talk about a couple of relevant things. So one, there was a lot of conversation around compliance manager and secure score and some things like that. Planet has a number of offerings that focus in on that, including when we go through and do the compliance manager evaluation, you have the ability to export that content into Excel spreadsheets. So even in the case where I think Tom asked, can I get credit for this third-party application? In some cases, yes, and in other cases, maybe no, and that's true in a number of things. When you actually export to the Excel spreadsheet, you get to put this is being handled by X or Y or Z in there, so that when there is any kind of audit or review, that could be captured and memorialized at point in time. Right, so we did a audit and review. We exported the contents to Excel. We made some additional notes. Sometimes customers will even put in their long-term remediation plans if they aren't something they can do immediately into the actual Excel spreadsheet, save it, and that way, if they're audited, they can just hand that over, which addresses it. Now I get to, as we wrap up here, I get to this session of You Already Own It Cloud Community Call was brought to you by Azure Advantage. Many of these services are in fact things that can be managed with our Azure Advantage solution. So even if, and O365 in certain cases as well, even if you are in fact, you come back and say, we don't really have all the resources to get this all set up, or we need a lot of help in getting it done. While that may be a project, the ongoing sort of care and feeding of this and adding the new features and bringing in new reports and those things can absolutely be managed and delivered through things like our Azure and O365 Advantage solutions. So with that, I want to thank everybody. Hope everyone has a great Independence Day on the 4th. And if there are any other questions, and I'll wait a couple seconds, I'll let you go and enjoy your holiday. All right, I will stop recording now. Thanks. Have a great day.